Now we've got the Democratic nominee for New York's 10th Congressional District, Dan Goldman. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's great to be here.
So you're in a pretty unique situation because most candidates for office haven't already been front and center in an impeachment trial. You were the lead counsel for Trump's first impeachment, so you've got pretty good insight into his criminality. Do you believe that he'll testify for the January 6th committee?
No, I think there's pretty much no chance he will. I think he will pretend as if he wants to, just like he did with the Mueller investigation. And ultimately, he'll then come up with some reason blaming, the committee or other, something else as to why, oh, I would, but I couldn't possibly because of their bias or whatever it is. I hope the January 6th committee calls his bluff and says, you want to come testify live? No problem. You can come testify however you want to testify, because he won't.
What are the consequences for ignoring a congressional subpoena here?
Well, we've seen what happened. I mean, Steve Bannon ignored one, and he ultimately was held in criminal contempt and was prosecuted and convicted for that charge. That's a longer process that requires a full House vote. That then in order to refer it to the Department of Justice. So I don't expect that to happen with a couple months left in this Congress. I wouldn't expect the Department of Justice would charge the former president with criminal contempt for violating rejecting or refusing to abide by a congressional subpoena. There are separation of powers issues. It's probably not something that the Department of Justice would want to do. And so it really, at the end of the day, there's probably very little that Congress will do to enforce this. And I think that's quite clear.
Just on the DOJ front, if you have someone like Steve Bannon, who the DOJ did move forward with an indictment for, and you have Donald Trump, and they're in the same ballpark, in the same arena, then what's to stop, other than the perception because of who Donald Trump is, what's to stop the DOJ from not looking like it's enforcing one but not enforcing the other for what's effectively the same crime?
Because Donald Trump is the former president of the United States, and there are open constitutional questions about whether Congress can subpoena a former president or about his conduct while he was president, pursuant to their subpoena power, which arises from their legislative authority. So the subpoena power in Congress is not a constitutional power. And so there are murky and somewhat complicated potential constitutional questions. So it would be a different situation than Steve Bannon was in.
So January 6th committee subpoena aside, just from a layman's perspective, it looks to me like the DOJ probe as far as Trump inciting January 6th has taken a long time thus far. Do you think that that's par for the course and this is just a frustratingly slow process always, or is this taking an extraordinarily long time?
I think both is the answer. So I think it took the Department of Justice too long to move from the charging those who were involved with the actual invasion of the Capitol on January 6th to the broader conspiracy that appears to have existed with Donald Trump at the center of it in an effort to overturn the election that culminated in January 6th for the most part. They did take too long, in my view, to continue to move into that investigation, which was quite obvious that it needed to be investigated for, pretty soon after January 6th itself. However, they have obviously started it, and they are going full bore on it right now. And there are a lot of people who say, I just watched these January 6th committee hearings. Why isn't Donald Trump locked up right now and charged? And the answer to that is because it takes a lot more to prepare an indictment and to complete a criminal investigation where you have to deal with rules of evidence. You have to deal with the reality of cross-examination of witnesses. And you have to deal with beyond a reasonable doubt, a different standard. So what happens in the courtroom is very different than what happens in a hearing room for a congressional committee hearing. And I've been in both. So I have a decent sense of it. What the DOJ needs to do is to take the information that we've seen in the January 6th committee hearings. They are going to have to run through all of the witnesses that had any impact, any influence, any association with any of the conduct, even ones that they wouldn't use for their affirmative case. But you have to really understand what every witness says so you know whether there are contradictory statements. You want to make sure you're vetting all the witnesses that you will use in order to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, which you would want to do if you charge the former president of the United States. It is an exhaustive and detailed and very time-intensive investigation.
So last week I interviewed Glenn Kirshner, who I'm sure you know, and he mentioned that what he was most impressed by when he attended the last January 6th committee hearing is the way that the January 6th committee laid out their case in such a way that would make it easier for the DOJ, for prosecutors to then pick up where they left off. All the language they were using was basically intended to lend itself to a prosecution. Do you think, based on your experience, are there any holes in the DOJ's case? Is there any reason that they wouldn't be able to move forward with or be able to secure an indictment?
So the problem with that is that we don't know the answer, and that there is no real way for us to know the answer unless we're on the inside reading the FBI reports of the interviews that the Department of Justice does with these witnesses. I think it's important to remember that, and I heard rumblings that, there may be aspects of these, even the witnesses we saw, aspects of their testimony that were not played that, might not be helpful to a prosecution. So we got sort of the best, so to speak, in these hearings, the strongest case that they could put forward. But there's no one on the other side to put up a defense case. There's no one on the other side to go through all the prior statements of that witness and say, well, wait a minute, you said this here, but you also said that there. Those are contradictory. What is that? And I think everybody needs to remember that cross-examination is the great truth teller in our system, and it's very important. What I like to say is two things. One, I think the January 6th committee has given us given us what I call a rebuttable presumption that Donald Trump should be indicted, which is to say that based on what we've seen, there's enough to indict him. It is possible that there's stuff we haven't seen that the DOJ has access to that rebuts the likelihood or the expectation that he would be charged. So it is completely possible that there's material, there's evidence, there are witnesses that we didn't see in the hearings that could contradict what the witnesses we did see. I think it's unlikely, but it's certainly possible, and we just are not in a position to know that. But the other thing is, I don't necessarily agree with Glenn that the January 6th committee has provided DOJ with a roadmap or something along those lines. What I think that the committee hearings have done, and they've been magnificent, and it really makes me jealous to see what you can do when you don't have to deal with the 5-minute rule of going back and forth, and you have 2.5 hours to make a great presentation, which they really have done. But what they've done is they've brought to life what will ultimately be an indictment. So if we didn't have the January 6th committee hearings and the Department of Justice charged this, we would have a document. It would be dozens of pages laying out the evidence, some of the evidence, laying out the case. But it would be written on a page, and the vast majority of Americans would not read it. And it would be very hard to sort of imagine what it is that they're talking about. The January 6th committee gave us a visual view of what that indictment will likely charge. And it makes it easier on the Department of Justice to be able to explain and for the American public to understand what the Department of Justice is charging. Because for those of us who have watched the January 6th committee hearings, we saw it. We saw the witness testimony. We saw video. We saw video of January 6th. I mean, we've seen all sorts of different, we saw surveillance video that we hadn't seen. We saw the Nancy Pelosi's daughter's documentary last time around. So there's a lot that we have seen now about that time that will be very helpful in painting a picture to the American people of what's in an indictment, which would not come out until a trial a year, 2 years after.
No, you're a former prosecutor. You're basically assured to end up in Congress. At the same time, we've seen a degree of lawlessness from the right that we haven't seen before. Is there a degree to which your presence in Congress will mostly be about oversight of government, like to protect government from within that government?
Perhaps not just federal government, but if you include state governments, I think that's a huge part of what we need to be focused on the next 2 years. And part of the reason I ran for Congress is I have a tremendous fear as to what the Republican legislatures around this country are doing in passing laws designed to allow elected officials, partisan elected officials, in all cases Republican, in those states, overturn the will of the people. And that is incredibly scary. They are trying to fix what they believe the problems were in 2020 that prevented Donald Trump from overturning the election, and they're trying to cure that by changing the laws to allow him to do that. I think the federal government and the Electoral Count Reform Act, of their versions both in the House and the Senate, will help greatly to prevent that from happening again. But that is a huge, huge threat to our foundational democratic values, to our voting rights, to our free and fair elections, which our whole system is based on. So yes, there will be a fair amount of investigation and oversight, I think, to ensure that we keep our democracy.
With that said, that kind of lends itself to my next question, which is, what would you like to see happen in Congress that's unique to you? So aside from codifying Roe and all that kind of stuff, is there anything that is specifically and personally important to you?
Oh, there are a tremendous number of things that are important to me. Obviously, making sure that we continue to have a robust and full democracy where the rule of law is followed and our institutions are supported and respected and separation of powers exists. I mean, all of our foundational values of our constitutional republic. But if you're talking policy, so, for me, I've got a number of things that I want to focus on, probably too many, because you can't do everything. But certainly, given my background, having been involved in the criminal justice reform movement and having been a contributor to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is the seminal book on mass incarceration and the discriminatory impact of our criminal justice system, and then having been a federal prosecutor for 10 years, I have a deep understanding of the criminal justice system, and I would like to dive into criminal justice reform. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to make our system fairer, to reduce incarceration while also making everybody safer. So that's certainly an area. I want to focus on early childhood education and early childhood development, including universal daycare. The data shows that young children, 0 to 3, who get access to high quality daycare, to books, to early childhood education, have outcomes that are far greater than what they would get without those. And it also helps to allow parents to continue to work and not to lose their jobs because they can go back to work right after childbirth. And then in my district here in New York, housing, as well as around the country, but there's a true housing crisis. I happen to live in the district with the most public housing, but there's also just an affordable housing crisis. And so I want to spend a good amount of time focusing on that and trying to figure out a way that we can provide more housing, more transitional housing, more supportive housing, to not only get homeless people off our streets, but to give them the dignity of living in their own home, which, studies show is, and those who believe in housing first, as I do, that you get people shelter over their head, they take on, they assume a lot more responsibility over their life, and they're able to get jobs and to be self-sufficient and self-sustaining from there.
on the flip side of all of that very good, all of those very good legislative proposals is that if Republicans are able to take the House, we're certain to see investigations from here until the end of the earth on Hunter Biden and Hugo Chavez and whatever else they can cook up. What's your response to these threats by Kevin McCarthy and the GOP if they're to take the House?
Well, I think they have to be very careful about overreaching. The reaction to the Bill Clinton impeachment was that his poll numbers skyrocketed because people felt like he should not have been impeached for, lying about his sex life. And I think that the Republicans should take note of that if they go down that road, there very well may be a backlash. I think what you describe will certainly happen, but I also think that Joe Biden will be impeached or Alexander Mayorkas will be impeached, and they will be impeached purely based on policy disputes, not based on any constitutional crime that they may have committed, such as abuse of power that Donald Trump did in the impeachment that I did, where he used the power of the presidency for his personal gain, or obviously in the second impeachment where he incited a coup and an insurrection and tried to overturn an election. I think if that is not impeachable, I don't know what is. But there's no question. I think the House will do whatever it can to get retribution on the Democrats and to get revenge. And that's something that we need to be prepared for.
What's your message to Republican and independent voters amid the prospect of a Republican House majority, where they would impeach Joe Biden for the crime of not being a Republican?
Look, the message to them is the same as the message now, but it will just be borne out with their frivolous investigations that take up so much time, and their refusal to actually govern, their refusal to negotiate, their refusal to agree to any kind of legislation, which I fully expect. And that message is the Republican Party under Donald Trump's control is no longer a good faith actor in the governance of our country. They are bad faith actors trying solely to gain power or to operate in their own personal interest, not in the interest of the party, of the country, or even of their constituents. And I think what they will show based on their conduct that we fully expect, they will show Republicans, they will show independents that they are bad faith actors and that they should be voted out if they are voted in this time.
And I would add to that, by virtue of wasting all of this time investigating, bullshit leads, just by virtue of them wanting to punish Democrats, all of the legislation that Democrats were able to pass in the last 2 years, like funding for climate change and allowing the government to negotiate lower drug prices, and the bipartisan infrastructure package and the American Rescue Plan, forgiving student loan debt, all of these things, those would be put to the wayside just to make way for investigations that are just going to be fodder for Fox News. So I think even putting that tribalism aside, it's just, what do you want Congress to be able to do for you? Do you want them to be able to combat climate change and protect reproductive rights and continue making healthcare more affordable, or do you just want more red meat for the Hannity and Laura Ingraham crowd? So,
and you're right, and I think the best example of what I'm trying to say that you're I think smartly adding on to is you look at the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There were a few Republicans who voted for it, but the vast majority did not. Those Republicans then go home and tout the infrastructure bill and the money that their districts are getting from the infrastructure bill, even though they voted against it. That is bad faith acting. And that happens all around the country. The CHIPS bill, which was the Chinese competition semiconductor technology bill, got 24 Republican votes in the House. Every group, every trade group, both the Chamber of Commerce, business, labor unions, everybody supported this. Every special interest, but the Republicans most of them couldn't bring themselves to support something that the Democrats might get some benefit from, because they are all about power. They're not about governing. They're not about improving the lives of Americans. And
you can guarantee yourself that when all of these plants open up in a place like Wisconsin, every single Wisconsin Republican is going to be there cutting tape with big scissors and
Exactly right.
taking all the applause in. Okay, let's finish off with this. What does a candidate in your position, running in a deep blue district, but who's already won the primary, what do you do in terms of helping other candidates now as we inch closer toward November 8th?
Well, that's basically what I'm doing right now, especially in New York, where there are about 8 very close races. There are several things that I have been doing. One is I've been going and going to fundraisers on behalf of my friends and fellow candidates. I created a leadership PAC where I'm raising money so that I can give money to those in the New York delegation who are running for office, but also others around the country. I've been devoting most of my time. I've been out in the field trying to help some of the other candidates. I've been devoting most of my time to helping other Democrats win, because as you point out, as we've just been discussing for the last 20 or so minutes, this election is so important to determine whether or not we will continue to make great progress in our policy prerogatives and our democratic values. And you mentioned so many: the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, the gun control legislation, CHIPS bill, obviously Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, so many things that the Biden administration and the Democratic House and Senate have gotten done in the past 2 years will all go to the wayside if the Democrats are not in the majority. The Republicans will stall everything. Everything will grind to a halt. So I'm doing everything I can to help us keep the majority.
We'll leave it there. Dan, thank you for taking the time, and looking forward to having someone like you with your experience, your background in Congress.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. Great to see you.